I'd like to first introduce our first speaker, Dr. or Phil Berg, who I said works with Pipestone Lamb and Wool. Um, he works in that program with Minnesota West Community and Technical College. And Philip was born and raised on a Pipestone area sheep farm, and he continues to work with his family sheep operation. And he worked for NDSU at Hedinger Research and Extension Center doing sheep research work prior to returning to Pipestone, where he worked as an extension agriculture educator. He works with a very progressive group of producers, and I'm excited to hear from him. So with that, I'll let you take it away, Phil. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Page. Again, I work with about 120 producers in southwestern Minnesota, and I'm going to probably put my video, close my video so that if there's issues with streaming. But I do work with about 120 producers in southwestern Minnesota and surrounding states. We do a variety of educational programs, workshops, do a lot of one-on-one with those 120 producers. We include webinars like this, as well as farm visits. And we do a lot of text, phone call, email interaction with those producers, providing weekly, monthly, current issues that are coming up. And so that's something that we're doing. In addition to that, we offer some online courses and some tours, Lambing Time short course, facility tour, and here in July we have a Sheep for Profit school. And so those are some of the outreach that we do as well. I'm going to focus my discussion on keys to successful early weaning. The producers in our group or in this region are weaning our lambs early, almost all exclusively. And that definition of early weaning is typically when the youngest lamb in a group is 42 days of age is when we're going to wean those lambs. And so that is going to mean that they're going to average around 45 to 50 days of age, maybe as high as 60 days of age on average, depending on how narrow our group is that we're going to wean. And so when the youngest lamb in the group is about 42 days of age, that's when we're going to wean them. Some of the principles, and I've got my slides in the wrong order, some of the principles of why we wean early is that young lambs are efficient feed converters. And so we can get our lambs to market with about 425, 440 pounds of feed or grain. And so they're very good converters of feed. They're very feed efficient at a younger age. They're growing very rapidly, and we're marketing those lambs at 5 to 6 months of age. Why is that important for us in this region? Is that we are trying to market our lambs in a low supply period. Typically this time of the year, when we're starting to market our lambs, is usually a low supply period, and this year definitely is a low supply period. And that low supply period kind of has, over the last many years, has been May through September, and maybe even into October is when we're trying to target to sell a lot of our lambs. And so that's part of the reason that we're early weaning our lambs. Another reason that we're early weaning our lambs is to reduce our ewe feed cost, our lactation diets. We need to feed our ewes to lactate and have milk, so we have fast growing lambs, but it's also our most expensive diet. And so it's one that we want to maximize or optimize the lactation and move on. And so that's why we're weaning a little bit earlier. Typically, and these are some numbers from some real old information that I've gotten, and it fits our ewes real well, is that peak milk production occurs at about 3 to 4 weeks into lactation under the breeds that we're using here, which is primarily a polypate-based ewe, with some Western Rambouillet and Targhee influence in there. Typically at 10 weeks of lactation, we're at half of the peak milk production. And so that peak milk production drops off fairly quickly. We assume that about 75% of all the milk that's produced out of the ewes that we raise in this area is going to be produced in that first 8 weeks. And so we're trying to maximize the milk production that we're getting from those ewes. But we also are trying to maximize the feed efficiency. And so it's kind of an optimum goal there. When we look at another advantage would be that we can cull our ewes, that if we have ewes, we wean them earlier, then they're available if we're going to cull them, that we can cull them sooner and capitalize on an earlier market, which typically is a little higher. And so that's an advantage for our producers as well. The longer the lambs are on side of the ewe, we have a higher risk of injury, and so we reduce some of our lamb injury. And then we remove some of the influences of the mother earlier. The mother likes to pull those lambs away from our creep area, away from our feed sources, and we try to remove that influence of that mother earlier on. So 2 key areas that I wanted to focus on is one is that you need to plan. And the second one is we need to get the lambs off to a good start, getting them on creep feed and how we set up that creep area. When we're planning, and that's probably the most important thing. I got a call yesterday from a producer that I don't work with that said, hey, I'm running out of feed. I'm going to wean my lambs today. And really hadn't set up anything, didn't plan anything, hadn't vaccinated his animals. That's probably a poor plan. And so when we start lambing, and when our group is moved into, we have different groups of lactating ewes, we try to keep that age spread as narrow as possible. And when we stop filling that pen, we're going to go to our calendar and say, all right, in 42 days, or approximately 42 days, that's when we're going to wean. And we're going to go back 2 weeks or 3 weeks from that point and mark off when we're going to start our dry down, when we're going to vaccinate our lambs. And so that gives us a plan, and we stick to that calendar rather than just looking at and say, gosh, today looks like a good day to wean. So planning is very important in terms of the early weaning. And the other part that's very important is that they need to be consuming feed for us to wean them early as well. And so I'll address that second. So when we look at the pre-weaning time, we're looking at 2 areas, both the ewe and the lamb. And from a ewe standpoint, we're going to start a dry down diet 2 weeks prior to, or 10 to 14 days prior to weaning. And that dry down diet is going to be as low in protein as we can possibly get our feeds, and maintaining the amount of energy. I'm more interested in getting the protein out of the diet, and keeping and I'll show some examples of some different dry down rations that we use. But we need to make sure that we keep enough energy in there so that the ewes, we don't compromise the ewe's health. And on a lamb standpoint, when we're weaning, 2 to 3 weeks prior to our weaning date that we marked on the calendar, we're going to vaccinate our lambs with their initial C&D toxoid. And that's basically all we vaccinate for in this area is for C&D, or enterotoxemia. And we're going to do that 2 to 3 weeks prior to our weaning. We're also going to, pre-weaning, we're going to start them on a 20% crude protein creep ration. And typically we try to provide that almost at day 1. They're not going to eat a whole lot the first couple of weeks, but we're going to try to provide that initially so that they have a source that they know where they can get some feed from. And that's where observation is important. Eventually, when they get closer to that weaning time period, around 45 days, they're going to transition and eat larger particle size. So when we start them off, we like to start them off on a little finer feed because they tend to like that a little bit better. Some common dry down rations that we use and probably the mainstay is to move them on to a lower quality grass hay, and about 3.5 pounds of that grass hay. And I should step back. This table, the top of this table shows the maintenance requirement for 176 pound ewe. It needs about 1.6 pounds of what we call total digestible nutrient, or TDN. And that's our energy source, or that's our amount of energy that we're measuring. And the crude protein, they need about 1/4 pound, or about 0.27 pounds of crude protein. And so typically grass hay, and I'm using a book value for grass hay, 3.5 pounds is going to be about 1.7. So we have plenty of energy for maintenance, but we're down, and we're about to sit right on protein level. Not all grass hay is at book value, and so you need to monitor what kind of nutrients you have in your grass. But typically that tends to work out very well. When we're thinking about a diet for lactation, those ewes on an energy basis, those same ewes are going to eat substantially more, or need substantially more energy. We're going to probably be almost double the amount of energy, and we're going to be about 3 times as much protein, typically for our lactation diets. And so we're shocking the system, both energy-wise and protein-wise, to help them stop or reduce their milk production. So grass hay is probably a great place to start. We have some people this year with forage is probably more expensive, but corn's going to be more expensive as well. They might choose to limit the grass hay and to a couple pounds and put 1 pound of corn in there. And that's going to be very similar to just the grass hay by itself. We do have people that will go 7 days of grass hay, and then they'll go 7 days with stover. And when they use stover, and when I think of stover in our area, it's typically corn stover or straw. And when we do go to corn stover and straw, we definitely need to keep 1 pound of corn in there to keep enough energy in there to meet their requirements. And so that's the reason that we probably would use a little bit of corn in there with our grass hay initially for that first week. And so this gives some different examples. I caution you on stover and straw alone. There was some research many years ago out of the University of Minnesota, and I believe out of Illinois, that showed that they tried to feed more stover, and 2 pounds was about all that they would consume. And even though you might provide them more, they have a difficult time eating more stover. And if that's all they eat, that's only going to be about 57% of their energy requirement, and we're going to compromise their health if we feed that for very long. And so we need to be very cautious on that. We do have quite a few people that use corn silage, and that works as a great dry down ration because of the fact it has limited protein in there, and typically keeps them full and provides enough energy. So those are just some examples. There's other things that you can do. Again, my goal out of dry down rations is to kind of shock the system, both energy and protein wise, but mainly protein wise, and bring them back to a maintenance diet. One of the things that I hear from people and get questioned on people is that, maybe we should be taking take them off feed and water for the last day. And is that beneficial? And the research that I've seen has shown that there's no impact on that. For the next year's lamb performance or somatic cell count, which would be a mastitis predictor, or milk production. And so that is not something that I would recommend, and I don't recommend to any of our producers to take them off feed or water, even for a short period of time. At weaning time, when we talk about weaning time, we're going to remove the ewes from the lambs and leave the lambs in the familiar environment that they're used to, so that they know where their feed comes from and where their feed is at. They know where their water is at. And typically those lambs, if we've done a good job of getting them on creep, they hardly miss a beat. They hardly miss their moms. And so keep them in a familiar surrounding, and that seems to work the best. We're going to pull those ewes off and put them in a small area, a well-bedded, clean area, for at least when we wean, for 7 to 14 days. We're going to try to keep them as far away as possible so the lambs can't hear them bellowing. And again, if the lambs can't hear them, many times those lambs within a day have already readjusted. This is also the time that we're going to booster our enterotoxemia to our lambs. And so we did the first shot 2 to 3 weeks prior to weaning. We're going to do that second shot right at that weaning time period. Many of our producers will take weaning weights to identify their best producing ewes, but at least we need to identify our smaller lambs and identify them back to the ewe and consider or look at culling any of those ewes that are producing smaller lambs. Following weaning, there's a couple of things that we want to do. We want to definitely observe our lambs in terms of health and nutrition, making sure that, I mean, this is the most stressful time of their life is right after weaning. And so we want to try to minimize that as much as possible, providing them the same environment, providing the quality feedstuffs so that they transition as well as possible. And making sure that they're consuming feed. The other thing that we want to do is make sure that they have enough space. And here in blue, I put in that we require, or we recommend, based on Midwest Plant Service guide, that you need 8 to 10 square foot per head for feeder lambs at 30 to 110 pounds. And I think initially that's probably enough space. We're starting to push our lambs and marketing and feeding our lambs to heavier weights than 110 pounds. And so we're increasing that requirement around 12 to 14. The more space we can give them, probably the less stress there is on those lambs. We're also going to observe those ewes in terms of their body condition, make sure that they're not going backwards too fastly and that their health is being compromised. We're going to observe for swollen udders, checking for mastitis during that time period as well. A week after weaning, we're going to sort off some of our thinner ewes, our older ewes, sometimes our younger ewes, and we might put them on a better ration if they've been dried down real well. Otherwise, we're going to keep them on that dry down for the second week. So we typically dry them down for a couple of weeks. And the keratin plug on the end of the teat forms around 7 days for most ewes. And so we try to keep them in that small area for at least that 7 days. Many people always want to push that bubble a little bit and get them out into bigger lots that are probably not as clean, where they can run around more. And so we try to minimize that as much as we can for at least that first 7 to 10 days. Mastitis prevention. I mean, obviously we do the dry down ration to help us in terms of mastitis so that we start to shut down our milk production. But there's a couple other things that we can do from a management standpoint. Cleanliness is very important. And providing enough space so that we have less contamination in there. I think also trauma can cause some mastitis concerns and issues if that ewe is running around and banging her udder around, and also the aggressive nursing. And so by putting creep out there, making sure that they're consuming creep, we hope to minimize some of that aggressive nursing in that area. The other thing is that from a nutritional standpoint, there's evidence out there that shows that vitamin E, selenium, and zinc all have an impact on mastitis. And so if they're deficient in those areas, we can see a higher incidence of mastitis. And so kind of our plan of attack is that we provide a trace mineral salt, free choice to our ewes year round that has sufficient amounts of selenium and zinc in it. And so that helps us in terms of a mastitis prevention strategy as well. Moving on, and I'm not sure how much time I've used. I probably have used majority of my time, but I want to talk just a little bit about creep setup and creep design. Again, we try to provide that early on. As soon as they move into a grouping pen, we try to have that creep area located there. Even though they're not eating a lot of feed, what we're trying to do is to train them that this is a refuge area. This is an area that they can go and find feed. We need to place that creep area in a high traffic area, a convenient area, typically sunlight. If we can get sunlight in that area, that's going to be more appealing. If we don't have any lambs in our creep area and they're all laying over in another spot, we need to consider moving our creep area, or at least planning for that in the future. And so that's really important. Keeping feed fresh, keeping lambs out of the feeder is important. Making sure that we have enough space in that creep area. We're targeting about 1.5 feet per head. And when we lamb in cold time periods, many times we put covers over our creep area. Just then that in itself entices lambs to go into those creep areas. Again, it's important that we attract those lambs to the creep area. We have lights on in the creep area that extend outside. That kind of entices those lambs to come in. But we need to have plenty of openings so that ewe can still see those lambs and lambs can still see those ewes. If they can't see each other, it's not as enticing for them. We put bales of straw in there so that the lambs can play on them and keep them clean and well bedded. I've got a few pictures of a few of the typical creep areas. You know, the top and bottom picture of the same creep area. The top one shows the light and how it extends out. It's really fresh. They have a small feeder. They have a board across the top of that feeder so that the lambs don't stand in that feeder, a bale that they can play in, and lambs can come in and out either side, and ewes can really see the lambs in there. Very well. Here's another one that's very enticing. A lot of lambs in there. If I was to do something different, there's a solid panel on the right side. I would try to open that up a little bit so that the ewes, you know, this ewe right here is bellowing to her lamb, and because she can't see it, and so that would be more enticing. I can't criticize too much because there is a lot of lambs in there, but that would be the one thing I would change. Again, the feed trough is in there. That is, the lambs can't get in that, and so it provides a fresher feed that way. Here's another one with a light, a lot of area that the ewes can see in. You know, a creep area. Again, they're not eating a lot of creep at this time. We're just trying to train them that, hey, there's feed in here. This is a good place for you to go. Here's one that has a cover on it that we use. Again, access from multiple areas, lights when they'll turn those on when they fill this up, well bedded as well. Here's just another one, you know, where we have access all the way around and very appealing as well. The last couple of slides I wanted to do, and this is some data out of University of Minnesota and University of Illinois, and I think this was done, I don't know, in the 60s. And it just looks at what they like to consume. And what I highlighted in our area, again, we're trying to get them on feed as soon as we can. And what do they like the best is soybean meal. And so they like those the best up to that 4-week time period, actually all the way through. But soybean meal is fairly expensive. And so we're going to transition them off of that soybean meal and over onto corn grain that we start to see them like to eat a lot more. And so that's where we're targeting a lot of our feedstuffs. We're pretty high in protein and soybean meal initially, and then we're going to continue to feed that to keep the protein in there and using soybean meal in there. But we're going to go over and we use corn in this area as well. And so that's again what we use. And as they get older, the other thing that we observe is that they like the fine particle size when they're young, And as they get older, they transition and leave the fines, and they like the larger particle size. And so we try to transition them that way as well. Again, this is something that we spend quite a bit of time on in terms of looking at and evaluating. The downside to this, and this would be something that I'd love to see some information on, and I can give you our experience with, is dry distillers and soybean hulls were not part of that. They probably weren't in existence when this study was even done. And so how they would fit into there, soybean or dry distillers is a small particle size. I have more questions, and maybe Dr. Morica will have a good answer to that. I question how well they like it. I mean, the smaller particle size, I think they like, but as they get bigger, I'm not sure they like it as well as soybean meal. But I don't have any evidence to show that other than what our producers have told us. Soy hulls, lambs tend to like. And so if and that has worked very well as well. But again, I don't have any specific data on that. Kind of in summary, from a lamb standpoint, first off, we need to make sure we're planning if we're going to early wean. And then from a creep setup and creep design, we need to make sure we provide attractive area, quality feed, keep it well clean, and make sure the lambs can see or use, and lambs can see each other in there. That's very, very important. So that's probably more than my 20 minutes that I was allotted. And so are there any questions or comments or?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. That was great. It was really good to see some of those pictures. I think is eye-opening for a lot of people how we can set things up. You do have a couple questions. So some of the questions you have, Phil, is one of the first ones that came in was actually asking how much of this information can pertain to goats. Not sure if you have a lot of producers in that area that also run goats.
I'm not an expert on goats, or I'm not even going to claim to be very knowledgeable at all. They'd be a small ruminant, very similar to a sheep. So I would assume that there would be some similarities. But I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, I would echo that a lot of these same concepts are relevant to goats as far as preventing mastitis, and some of the methods to wean are just as effective in goats. Some of the other questions you have coming in are talking about dollar amounts. So one being about how many dollars go to the lamb prior to weaning, and then how many dollars of feed go into the lamb after weaning. And this is obviously varies year to year and in different management systems, but can you kind of answer some of that maybe broadly?
Well, I'm going to broadly answer that, and you can determine what the cost of your feed ingredients are. And so from a creep standpoint, we have about 25 pounds of creep that's consumed on average per lamb up till weaning. So about 25 pounds of creep is what we have. And then we're going to have about 400 pounds of additional feed that we're going to put into them after weaning. And there might be a little bit of an overlap there. We're probably feeding a little bit more than just the creep to the lambs. We're transitioning them a little bit at the end, but I would say around 30, 40 pounds at the most of the pounds of the feed is going to go to weaning and before, and the majority of that feed is going to be later. Typically, if I look at our last year's enterprise analysis, I think we were at about $50 a lamb. This year, we're going to be substantially probably $15 to $16, maybe even $20 more per lamb to feed those lambs out. So I think right now we're figuring our finishing diet is going to be about 15.5 cents, and we're probably 16.5 cents for our grower diets, and then our creep, we're probably at close to 18 to 20 cents for our creep.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good. And, you know, with hay prices and kind of drought this year, I think it's important to put those numbers to work. And then another question you had, I believe this is when you first initially started about um, weaning management with the ewes. It was about whether or not ewes were in dry lots or out on range, but I'll let you answer that.
Okay, so most of we're lambing in February and March, January, February, March, and even April. And at least in our area, those months, most of our pastures are white. And so there is no pasture. And so they're all in dry lot.
Okay.
And we do have some accelerated lambing. And so we do have some people lambing in the fall where they would have access to pasture, but pasture in our area is limited and probably more expensive. And we would lose more control over the ewes when they go out to pasture. Might be good when we turn them out there. And if we're not monitoring them, they can go backwards fairly quickly. And so if we have more pasture, what I encourage producers to do is to get more ewes. Typically our lambs, I would say almost 100% of our lambs never see pasture.
Okay. And then you have one last question, Phil. The question is, what are some of the indicators present to tell you to start transitioning to a finishing feed? And I believe this is for those lambs we were talking about. How you said they were kind of moving up on feed types as they age up.
Correct. So typically under our system, and again, we're pushing them as fast as we can, and we're marketing them at about 5 months of age. And so for that to work, when we transition them, we're looking at about moving them from a creep to a grower when they're at about 45 days old, or 45 pounds, or approximately 45 pounds, because that's about what they're gaining a day, is about a pound a day. And then at about 85 pounds, we're transitioning them from our grower into our finisher. And so our creep is at 20% protein, our grower is at 16, and our finisher is at 13% protein.
Okay, well, that sounds good.